believe we were doing it even as we were thrown to soup.
We were put in a van, and that was the last time I felt freedom.
I had no idea that 2 years was on the cards.
If you do go to prison, is that something you can cope with? And he said yes.
I do feel guilty because ultimately I have chosen this over her.
The single most effective way to change society is to engage in resistance to going to prison.
The judge then says, right, I'm sentencing you to 2 years. How are you feeling at that point?
It's a mad combination of like sadness and bravery. Like you have to accept it. You have no other option. So if you fight it, you're only hurting yourself, really.
In August 2024, 24-year-old George Simonson was sentenced to 2 years in prison for climbing a gantry on the M25 as part of a Just Stop Oil protest. His parents, sister and partner were watching from the wings. He saw his partner had tears in her eyes.
I tried to put on like a brave face for my family and like waved goodbye to them, like from through the dock. You go immediately down to the court cells.
George's brave face cracked pretty quickly.
I just started crying as soon as I went through the door.
The sentence came as a shock to George. He and his co-defendants had pleaded guilty to some of the charges, so he knew he was getting some kind of sentence. But given the gantry's arrest was only the second time George had come face to face with a police officer, and the most he'd ever got before was a fine, George thought it was going to be a suspended sentence at most.
I had no idea that 2 years was on the cards. Like, I did not expect that. I thought chances are it'll be like a year suspended or custodial. I thought that was the likely outcome, given all of the trials that had happened previously. So then I just got taken down to the court cells and had a big cry, basically.
In the end, Judge Shane Collery was much harsher than anyone expected, telling the gantry climbers, it's easy to be blasé when it's not your life that's disrupted.
Judge Collery's decision was one of several that Just Stop Oil activists appealed for being excessively punitive. Ultimately, the courts didn't reduce George's sentence, but agreed that some other activists had been punished too harshly and lowered their remaining sentences. Even in the time between George's action and his sentencing, the government and justice system had become much more hostile towards climate activists. Under a new act brought in 2022, judges had handed Just Stop Oil activists the longest sentences ever given in the UK for non-violent protest.
Because George was bailed until the day of his sentencing, he literally walked into the court a free man, and as soon as the judge's gavel had hit the block, he was being taken away by court security. No goodbyes, no closing remarks, no nothing. The moment George had been nervously awaiting for so many months had finally arrived. He was going to prison. I'm Rivkah Brown.
And I'm Clare Heimer. And this is episode 2 of Committed, a Novara media podcast about why some people are willing to go to prison for their politics. In episode 1, we looked at how the government's crackdown on protest rights has created a dilemma for activists: either retreat from more disruptive forms of protest, or continue pursuing them and risk prison. We looked at how, while some climate groups have chosen to swerve imprisonable action, others, like Just Stop Oil, have accepted prison as a possibility. We asked how Just Stop Oil has persuaded so many to follow them into the breach, how ordinary law-abiding people have agreed to take action that they might never have imagined taking just a few years before. We discovered the kinds of experiences in people's lives that make them willing to go to prison, and asked ourselves, as two people who also believe that the climate crisis demands an urgent response, why aren't we willing to do the same?
We met George Simonson, who we heard just there, a teenage gamer turned M25 gantry climber. We met Anna Holland, a self-described goody two-shoes, who became notorious after they threw soup at a Van Gogh painting.
We also met Rory Wilson. who turned to Just Stop Oil after realising that doing his recycling wasn't going to stop the climate crisis. And we met Luke Elson, an aspiring painter who credits joining the climate movement with lifting him out of a deep depression. We'll meet all of them again, as well as another, Rosa Hicks, who was arrested at the same time as Luke and Rory in connection with an action at Heathrow.
This episode, we take you behind bars to discover how Just Stop Oil activists adjust to the abject boredom and arbitrary cruelty of prison, and the unexpected encounters they have with other prisoners.
We'll follow them from the moment of their sentencing to their new homes, tiny cells in Britain's overcrowded prisons. We'll see how they adjust to the shock of confinement, and find out what day-to-day life inside is really like. Then we'll ask what the other inmates and prison guards think of them, and what it's like to be among the country's only political prisoners. Does going to prison for what you believe in make life behind bars any easier?
But we're also interested in prisoners generally. Because of their platform and their networks, climate prisoners can shine a light on all of the 98,000 people currently imprisoned in the UK. In this episode, you'll hopefully learn a lot about their treatment too.
Rivkah, how do you think you imagined prison when you first started making this podcast?
I didn't really have any reference points. Obviously, I've listened to the podcast Ear Hustle, which is very good, but also about American prisons. So I guess I thought that the UK would be something similar to that. I think I also judge that based on the fact that the UK treats people who rely on the state, whether that's people who are in prison in the kind of custody of the state or, benefit claimants or whatever, terribly. So I was just guessing that it would be awful, basically. I also don't think I have spent a huge amount of time thinking about what prison's like, which is funny because I cover policing quite a lot in my reporting. Prison is a bit of a black hole. It's supposed to be. It's supposed to be a place where you put people to be forgotten about, for society to sort of not look at. And I think it kind of works. Yeah, I suppose those were my preconceptions. What about you?
I mean, until we started making this podcast, I'd never been to a prison. And I think my knowledge of prisons was pretty limited to, seeing, like you say, American TV dramas like Orange is the New Black. I've read a number of books which detail what life is like for political prisoners. I'm thinking specifically of Nelson Mandela's The Long Walk to Freedom, where he talks about how he's passing the time during long periods of isolation over decades. I think I'd maybe thought a little bit about what it might be like to be in prison and have such a long stretch of time in front of you, and whether I'd be able to cope with that, how I'd pass the time, whether I'd feel able to pass the time productively. But yeah, like you say, I hadn't really thought loads about it, if I'm honest.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we've had this experience of speaking to so many prisoners, because my perception of prison in this process has changed enormously. Not just the objective facts of what it's like, but also what my experience of it might be like if it was me.
But in some ways, for some prisoners, the day-to-day experiences weren't as dramatic or as violent as they're often made out to be on the TV or in the news, at least inside women's prisons. But what was shocking to me was hearing about this kind of slow violence of a prison system under massive strain, which is already designed to dehumanise people and isolate them from wider society.
So I think we should really take people through what happens when you go to prison from the moment of your sentencing. So George has been handed a 2-year sentence, he's been taken to the court cells, and then what? Well, the court officers take his prison bag off him. That's a bag of very basic stuff that George knew he could take in because he was prepared for prison. Even though George hadn't expected to receive a custodial sentence, he'd still, in the 2 years between his arrest and sentencing, been doing a bit of preparation just in case he did. This preparation was helped by the fact that Just Stop Oil puts on prison briefings and puts activists facing time in touch with former prisoners. Then there's this group called Rebels in Prison, an organisation that supports political prisoners. It's produced a 28-page guide called Preparing for Prison, which includes everything from what will be in your cell, to how to get extra flavour in your food, to how to make contact with people on the outside. Rebels in Prison also sets up prospective prisoners with what's known as a prison buddy, who are so essential to all of the people we've spoken to and to us in our journalism. These buddies are usually other political activists who act as go-betweens between the prisoner and the outside world. They can convey information to prisoners about their upcoming trials and top up prisoners' accounts so they can call people.
So what exactly did George take in with him?
Clothes, though no hoods, nothing that looks like a guard's uniform, no high-top shoes, but mostly just books. The suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst's autobiography. Incidentally, Emmeline's great-granddaughter Helen Pankhurst recently expressed her support for Just Stop Oil prisoners. George also brought a book called The Spirit Level: Why Equality is Better for Everyone. The kind of books you'd imagine a climate activist would take into prison.
It sounds like what you're saying is that maybe in practical terms, George was relatively prepared.
Yeah, I mean, in the way you might be for your first day of school. He'd packed his bag, he'd read the manual, but all the preparation almost heightened his anxiety about what it would be like emotionally to go to prison.
I was really grasping for an idea of what it would be like what to expect, but I really didn't know, because you can't look up day in the life of a prisoner. I don't think that really exists. So I would just try and talk to people that had gone to prison for an honest representation of what it was like.
Okay, so George has had his stuff taken off him. He's feeling really nervous. Then what happens?
So then George gets taken to the court cells. These are directly attached to the court building and are designed for prisoners to sit in before they're taken to prison. So there's not a lot in them. Not a bed, not even a toilet. It's just a hard seating area and a bell in the corner that you can press to speak to an officer. George waited around for a bit and then got picked up by a Serco van. The vans are small, cramped, and there's no air conditioning, so they can get really hot. The only upside for George was that he got put in there with his co-defendants so they could chat.
Where did they take him?
Well, the two women in George's trial group got taken to a women's prison, HMP Peterborough, and the men got taken to HMP The Mount, a men's prison in Hertfordshire. The Mount is a Category C prison, meaning that it's lower security and designed for prisoners that are unlikely to escape. That doesn't mean it's nice, though.
And what were his first impressions?
Well, the Mount is an unlovely but relatively modern building, opened in the late 80s. It's a sort of long, squat, red brick building with a large sloped roof. But beyond that, it was really difficult for George to get a sense of what the prison was like generally, because as a prisoner, you only ever see a tiny bit of it. In George's case, as in the case of all new prisoners, that's what's known as the induction wing.
It's a strange experience at the start. It's almost a little bit claustrophobic because you don't really know what's going on around you, and you're limited to such a tiny area.
In some ways, being on the induction wing is easier than the regular wings, but in other ways, it's harder. Prisoners always share cells on the induction wing at the Mount, for example. You can't do any prison jobs yet, so you're stuck in your cell most of the day. The vegan food is utterly shit. One prisoner told us they'd had a lettuce sandwich for lunch, and Luke said he once got a delicacy known as rice with rice. Those early days can be pretty bleak.
That was definitely the case for Anna Holland, the Van Gogh soup thrower. After their sentencing, they were sent to HMP Bronzefield. That's a women's prison in Surrey. But because of the time of week they got sentenced, a lot of the prison administration had shut down, meaning they had to wait even longer to get set up.
Because I was sentenced on a Friday, that meant the first 2 days I was in prison, I had no money on my accounts, I had no emails coming through, no messages, I had no contact with the outside world at all.
Anna added people to their call list, but they weren't approved for several days.
I tried calling them just constantly and it kept getting declined. I kept not being able to talk to them. And it was on that Tuesday evening, the isolation of the separation, it really hit me. And that was the first time I properly cried after my sentence.
Those early weeks were especially difficult for Rosa Hicks. Rosa was sent to Bronzefield after an attempted action at Heathrow in July 2024.
Because this is my first time in prison, I had preconceptions
preconceptions, as I'm sure lots of other people who haven't been to prison do, namely that it was going to be dark and dirty, and then there were going to be, other prisoners who could be quite scary and intimidating.
Rosa's preconceptions were wrong about the other prisoners. They were lovely, she said, and many of them really shouldn't be here. She wasn't totally wrong about the prison itself, though. Rosa has a chronic shoulder injury that has caused her huge amounts of pain on and off for years. When she first got to prison, she couldn't access her regular supply of pain medication. Her pain got so bad that she wasn't able to climb into her bunk and had to sleep on the hard floor of her cell. At one point, she was even unable to use the toilet and had to ask for incontinence pads. Eventually, things got easier, but it was a pretty brutal start.
Luke, meanwhile, was shipped straight off to Wormwood Scrubs, the imposing Victorian prison in West London. Rosa and Luke were put on what's known as remand, which means pre-trial detention. A huge number of prisoners in England and Wales are on remand. About 18,000 people as of September 2024, which is just over 20% of the total prison population. Here's Luke talking about how even though he'd prepared for prison in all sorts of ways, it was deeply frustrating and even degrading to have no control over his environment.
It is horrendous being dehumanised in this place and just treated like a number and not being really considered, or not having your health or your feelings really considered properly. You just have to make peace with it. You can't get angry or resentful about it because there's nothing you can do here. You have no power. If you don't make peace of it and just kind of flow like water, then the anger and resentment will kind of eat you alive.
So after finishing on the induction wing, which could be just a few days but could last a couple of weeks, you get placed on your regular wing, which if you're lucky, means getting your own cell. Here's Luke describing his.
So there's obviously a big metal door that I can't open. If I had to guess the size of my cell, it's probably about 12 foot by 8 or 9 foot. A good way to picturise it is if you imagine a box room in a typical semi-detached house, it's slightly bigger than that box room, but not much bigger.
Yeah.
And then you've got your sink and your toilet. You normally have a little desk with a plastic chair. And then you have another little table or cupboards for your TV and your clothes. And then you've got a bed with a foam mattress, which is about, 5 inches thick, but isn't very comfortable. And the foam goes flat pretty quickly. And then you have a window with bars. And then you can't actually open the windows. And that's pretty much it.
What Luke doesn't say here is that his cell is also really unclean. Luke's had cockroaches. One day he found a dead mouse in his shoe. Despite all this, Luke's really attached to his cell because he spends so much time there. Here he is fondly describing what he calls his one-bedroom flat.
You do everything in your cell. You eat in your cell, you sleep in your cell, you read, you write. It becomes your I call my bed my chair of many chairs because it's where I eat my dinner. It's where I watch TV. It's where I read. It's where I sleep. It's where I sit when I speak on the phone.
Yeah, prisoners have phones. That's how we spoke to almost all of the prisoners on this podcast, in fact. But they're not like regular phones. You have to ask to add people to your call list, which can take weeks and has to be approved by the prison. The calls are only one way, so prisoners can call you, but if you miss the call, you can't call them back. And the prisoners can't hear if they're being put through to you or to your voicemail, which creates kind of tragic situations like this.
You have one new voice message.
Hello? Hi, Rivkah. Just in case these are leaving voicemails, this is Phoebe from Bronzefield. Phoebe from Just Up Oil ringing from Bronzefield again.
Prison calls are randomly monitored, so you can't talk candidly to people when you're on the phone to them. Some prisons will let you make unlimited calls, but others, like Wormwood Scrubs, where Luke is, will cut off calls after 30 minutes or so.
There's the beep, so I'll have to call back in 5, okay?
Okay, speak to you in a sec. Prisoners also have TVs in their cells, although linear channels only. Apparently, in George Simonson's prison, The Mount, some prisoners fashioned a makeshift aerial and broadcast bad quality satellite channels. He tried copying them, but it went badly. George said he watches quite a lot of TV. Sometimes he and the guy in the next cell watch the same show at the same time. People also read the books they've brought in. They paint. Luke got some paint sent in by a friend and has been painting again. Though interestingly, he told me he's doing more figurative and less abstract stuff these days. He's been painting flowers because that's what he says he misses.
Meanwhile, a lot of what George and his fellow prisoners spend their time doing in prison is vaping. Smoking was banned inside prisons in 2018, but by that point vaping was allowed. Now, as you can imagine, vaping is everywhere in prison.
I actually did a Freedom of Information request to the Ministry of Justice about this recently. Apparently, in the year ending March 2024, prisoners spent £21 million on vapes, which is up 10% on the previous year. Prisoners exchange vape caps, which is like the bit that you plug into a reusable vape, in return for food and stuff like that, and as a way of getting around the ban on cash in prisons. Apparently, if you're interested, the flavour that's most valuable at the Mount, where George is double bubble.
I'm a bit of like a currency exchange actually, because I don't mind the flavour. So loads of people come to me and they're like, "Oh, George, can I swap a menthol for a tobacco?" And I'm like, yeah, sure.
But they're not just buying food with these vape caps, right?
No, of course not. I mean, drugs, illegal drugs, that is, are massive in prison. It's funny, when I spoke to Luke a while ago, there was this infuriating background noise. You might actually be able to hear it on some of the recordings. He said that the prison was doing work on the windows at Wormwood Scrubs, and I was like, what? You said they never fix anything? And he was like, yeah, they don't. They're not redecorating the prison. They're putting additional bars over the windows to stop people flying drones in with drugs and stuff. In fact, the drone problem in prisons is so bad that in November, prison inspectors described one prison in Lancashire as like an airport.
Hi, it's Claire again. Before we continue, I wanted to let you know that you won't be hearing any ads on this podcast because Novara Media is funded by people like you. We don't depend on brand partnerships or sponsored content, and that's what makes our journalism fearless. Nobody tells us what to say. So if you're enjoying Committed and want us to keep on making the kind of journalism you won't find anywhere else, why not join our growing community of supporters? Head to novaramedia.com/support. One of the things I was shocked by when we were making this podcast was just how little time some of the people we spoke to get to spend outside their cells each day.
So how much time you get outside of your cell depends on the security level of the prison. Wormwood Scrubs, where Luke Elson is locked up, is a medium security or category B prison, meaning he gets about an hour out of his cell each day. The Mount, where George is a low security or category C prison, so he automatically gets a minimum of about 3 hours out of his cell each day. Bronzefield, where Rosa and Anna are, is technically a maximum security or category A prison, but it's actually got a variety of prisoners in there with different levels of restrictions. Luke's day in a life is this. He gets let out at 9 a.m. for an hour of social time, then it's back to his cell. Except on a Friday morning, when he gets to go to the gym for an hour, though that's randomly closed sometimes. Then he gets half an hour a week to go to the library, although again, not always on. Other than that, 23 hours in a cell each day, every day. Even the state thinks that's excessive. In 2021, the prison inspector explicitly said that Wormwood Scrubs prisoners were locked in their cells for too long each day. You do get quite a few more hours out of your cell if you work. So on the induction wing, you usually sit a maths and English test, which helps the prison identify if you might be eligible for tuition in those subjects, but also what jobs you might be suited to. These jobs range from manual labour, like making clothes or furniture, to teaching other prisoners.
Rosa got offered a job as a peer support worker in a maths classroom. She loves it, partly because she finds the job rewarding, partly because she gets an extra 5 or so hours outside of her cell. It's also the one time of day she feels less surveilled. She told me that she and the other prisoners in the class often get left alone completely.
I have a teacher in my classroom twice a week on 2 days, but at the moment they are very understaffed and that means I don't have a teacher for the rest of the week. So it's just me in the classroom. But I actually do quite like that because I think everyone is a bit more chilled when you've not got an officer with their handcuffs and their earpieces and their uniforms like glaring at you.
The job also means Rosa earns money, which she can spend on things like food. But it's pitiful pay. The minimum prisons can offer you per week is £4. Though in 2010, the average working prisoner earned £10 per week.
Which is obviously an insult, though the money isn't the main incentive for Rosa, it's the freedom. For other prisoners, though, having a job just isn't worth it. Luke gave up his as an educational mentor in Wormwood Scrubs because he didn't feel like he was helping anyone. George worked for a while fixing bikes at the Mount, but found it deeply dull and depressing because there was no supervision, so it was sort of pointless, though he did enjoy the social contact. I think people might want to know who the Just Stop Oil prisoners socialise with. Do they hang out with each other, for example?
Not really. Anna and Phoebe, they're the two suit throwers, initially both got sent to Bronzefield. They spoke in the van on the way to the prison, but as soon as they got there, they got put on different wings and so never saw each other. You do sometimes get serendipitous encounters, though. One day, Anna spied Rosa through the gates of their prison wing.
She came over and managed to convince one of the guards to open it to hug me. And it was amazing, talking to someone who knew who I was and knew me from the outside. It was like I'd become real again. It was just an absolute flurry of, oh my God, I can't believe you're here. I can't believe you're here. And she brought over some oat milk for me because I hadn't gotten any semblance of vegan pag yet. And yeah, we only had a few seconds before she had to go again. But it felt like we were stood for hours talking.
It wouldn't be long, though, before Anna and Rosa were separated again. Soon after, Anna was moved to HMP Send, a lower security women's prison where they were able to socialise with other Just Stop Oil prisoners more easily. Of course, they do get visits from people on the outside too.
That's if their friends and family can get to them. Luke's is in Leicester, and he's 100 miles away in Hertfordshire. It depends on the prison, but prisoners usually get around 4 visits a month, though it can be between 2 and 6. You also get more visits when you're on remand versus when you're sentenced, usually. I actually went to visit Luke not long ago. Booking the visit was a whole thing. You can't just book, it turns out. You have to sort of request several dates, wait a few days, and then you sort of get a verdict about whether or not you're allowed to visit. When I did eventually manage to book to see Luke, I was sent via email a whole load of things from the prison that I wasn't allowed to wear, like short skirts and revealing clothing, sort of like school uniform rules, which was kind of degrading, honestly. It sort of made me feel like, am I in prison? Actually, funnily enough, the visitors centre of Wormwood Scrubs did feel a bit like a school. This sort of low-rise modern building with big windows and colourful furniture and a community art centre attached to it. Also, like a primary school, the visitors centre is staffed almost exclusively by young women, and the waiting area is taken up mostly by a colourful children's library and play area. The whole thing feels sort of designed to make children feel less traumatised about going to visit prisoners. Once we got through the sort of airport-style security, which I somehow managed to avoid giving my fingerprints during, but most visitors do, the visit itself wasn't the kind of mouthing through perspex that you see in American films. Luke and I sat on these plastic chairs about 5 feet away from each other on either side of a small plastic table. It doesn't sound very far away, but actually when you're sat there, it feels weirdly far, like you couldn't reach over and touch them. If prisoners have enhanced status, which means they've earned some privileges, they and their visitors can sit on a sofa. That's right, sitting on the sofa is a privilege. If you're a child, you can sit on the prisoner's knee, but if you're an adult, you can hug hello and goodbye, and that's it. Other than that, it's strictly no touching.
So no conjugal visits, as they say in the US?
Oh, absolutely not. There did seem to be lots of partners there during my visit to Luke, though. In fact, that seemed to be the main demographic.
That's interesting because there weren't so many partners at the women's prison Bronzefield when I visited Rosa there. And I actually think that the next episode is the perfect time to revisit that. In episode 3, we'll talk about how you sustain relationships with those on the outside when you're in prison.
Visits are obviously one of the main privileges that prisoners get, and they can actually earn more. So let's talk a bit about privileges. Everyone comes into prison on what's known as standard conditions, a certain amount of visits per week, money you can spend in the shop, amount of time on the phone. If you break the prison rules in some way, you're rude to a guard, you get into a fight with another inmate, you might get put on what's known as basic conditions. That means less and, in some cases, none of those things. On the flip side, you can get what's known as enhanced status. That means more money, more visits, more privileges. But it involves sucking up to the guards. If someone smashes up their cell, for example, you might offer to clean it up for them, or you might volunteer to clean the showers. George Simonson did several jobs for prison guards at HMP The Mount and received enhanced status.
Doesn't everyone hate enhanced prisoners then?
Weirdly, not really, because they're sort of doing jobs that other prisoners appreciate. If you clean someone's cell, that just means someone on the induction wing can move in quicker. There are some jobs that will make other prisoners hate you, though, like reminding them that they need to take drug tests. If you do those kind of jobs that are seen to annoy or harass other prisoners, then you become what's known, in men's prisons at least, as a screwboy.
Screwboy as in screws as in prison guards?
Yeah, that's right.
So far in this episode, we found out about what it might be like for anyone entering prison and adjusting to a completely new day-to-day reality. But the Just Stop Oil prisoners aren't just anyone. Most of them knew what they were getting themselves into, and you might think that both the nature of their crimes and the kind of people that they are would alienate them from other prisoners.
I'd assumed that dropping a group of nerdy climate activists into prison would be a recipe for disaster, but it's actually been fine. George said that he's been surprised by how lovely everyone's been to him. He plays cards for hours every day with a group of other prisoners. He's also had some pretty eye-opening encounters with his fellow inmates, including this one guy at his job.
He initially said that he was in for swearing at a policeman, and I was like, damn, that's crazy, and they sent you to prison for that? He was like, yeah, that's mad, isn't it? And then it was literally like a month later, when he was like only a few weeks from being released, that he said something like, yeah, I'm in here for the same reason as you, referencing me in a conversation. And I was like, what do you mean by that? And then like only when I like got back to my cell or something did I realize that he was in a protest, which was definitely the like anti-immigration riots.
Okay, wow, so this guy took part in the far-right riots last summer.
Yeah. The ones that happened after a teenager who the far-right claimed was Muslim and an asylum seeker stabbed and killed 3 girls at a dance studio in Southport.
It makes no sense to me that someone who participated in racist riots felt like he and George were kindred spirits. You'd have thought that he'd have hated George.
Yeah, I thought that too, but kind of makes sense if you think about it. I suppose the rioter felt like he had something in common with George, in that both of them believe there's something badly wrong with society and they need to step up and do something about it. Even George sort of got this logic when we spoke. You know, he felt the man had drawn totally wrong and racist conclusions, but from a basically correct instinct that society isn't fair and that he's on the receiving end of it.
I think we sort of just realised both of us feel like this existing political system isn't working, and maybe our like solutions that we want to see are completely different, but at least we have that like shared value where it's like whatever's going on is completely messed up, even if our understanding of what's wrong is different. You can kind of bond over how messed up everything is, you know.
I also think there is some kind of unifying experience to being in prison that makes you sympathetic to other prisoners. You know, you're going through this really horrible experience, and it's hard not to feel for other people who are going through it too. I actually think climate prisoners get quite a bit of respect from other prisoners for standing up for something and willingly risking their freedom for it, which kind of surprised me.
It surprised me too, the unexpected connections between Just Stop Oil activists and other prisoners. But I did assume that they would get treated differently by the prison guards, not just because they tend to stick out among the general prison population, but also for the reason that they're there. But George told us something quite different.
with other prison staff, like prison guards, I've like semi-regularly, when they find out what I've done, they will say like, look, I'm not allowed to say what I think, but good on you. Or like, it's a cause I really respect. So like, you're paying the price and thank you. Or like people saying that, I shouldn't be in here, this kind of thing.
To be honest, George is a bit ambivalent about the response he gets from guards. He appreciates their support, but also recognises it partly derives from quite a racist and classist idea about the kind of people that should be in prison.
There is definitely like white privilege and class privilege in that, like, I think people, like the guards just sort of, I don't know, I think they treat me with like more respect, and it's been easier for me to get certain privileges than other people, which has been really, really uncomfortable.
This racism in particular shows up a lot in the disparity between how climate prisoners, who are generally white and middle class, are treated versus Palestine activists, who include many more non-white people. Palestine prisoners are largely associated with Palestine Action, a direct action group founded just a couple of years before Just Stop Oil out of a similar frustration with more standard forms of political campaigning. In August 2024, 6 Palestine actionists were arrested after they allegedly broke into an Israeli weapons factory in Filton, Bristol. A further 12 were arrested in raids following the action. Together, they're known as the Filton 18. The Filton 18 have been in prison without trial ever since. At the time of recording, that's well over the 182-day standard pre-trial custody limits for Crown Court trials. The Filton 18 have been treated particularly harshly while in prison. They've reportedly been denied phone calls and even contact with their solicitors. One prisoner, Zoe Rogers, said she had so many problems accessing her medication and the withdrawal symptoms became so bad that she had to stop taking it. Palestine Action prisoners held at the women's prison Bronzefield have reportedly been given non-association orders, which means they get fewer family visits and can't attend their own court hearings in person. They've also reportedly been transferred to other prisons without their families being notified. One Just Stop Oil prisoner told me that the Palestine Action prisoners aren't allowed to speak to each other or even to work. Palestine Action prisoners have reported having tons of mail not getting through to them, and numbers from their call list rejected. Part of the reason the prison system can be so harsh to the Filton 18 is because some are being held under counter-terror laws, even though none have actually been charged with terror offences. Things have got so bad that in January this year, 4 UN rapporteurs wrote to the UK government, raising concerns that counter-terrorism law was being abused to unduly punish Palestine actionists.
The Home Office didn't respond to Novara Media's request for comment, though in a statement to Middle East Eye, a government spokesperson said, "The UK has a comprehensive counter-terrorism legislative framework, which strikes the right balance between protecting national security and individual freedoms. However, neither the right to freedom of expression nor the right to protest is absolute."
Luke said that he's found a nifty way of getting around the prison system's attempt to isolate political prisoners, particularly Palestine Action prisoners. He tells them to go to the Buddhist chapel. Though he did tell me that the only reason was because it's the least objectionable of any of the religious services, and it allows prisoners a few minutes either side of the meditation practice to chat. Which brings me on to how I think climate prisoners cope with being in prison. On the one hand, they have to learn how to be passive. Remember how Luke talked about learning to flow like water?
Rosa also said something along those lines when she was explaining how she tries to cope with a lack of agency in prison.
Just that absolute no control over anything, not over my food, not over my routine. But once I just surrendered to that basically, and I just accepted, okay, no, I can't change that, and maybe I'll be locked in even though I'm meant to be at a doctor's appointment and they won't come and get me and I won't be able to go and I'll miss it. Like, initially that would really stress me out, but now I've just learned to accept it and go with the fact that I don't have control over these things.
So they have to learn to relinquish control, which is maybe not the most natural instinct for an activist. But also, activists cope with being imprisoned by remaining activists. Luke has kept on organising his fellow political prisoners while in prison by getting them together at Buddhist chapel. All of the prisoners are doing activism just by speaking to us and using Novara Media's platform to raise awareness of their imprisonment and their cause, as well as the conditions for prisoners in general. I've actually noticed this quality a lot in our prisoners. They tend to focus a lot less on their own suffering than on the suffering of those around them, which I guess is why they became activists in the first place.
Luke on the inside is no different in some ways to how he was on the outside. He feels a sense of responsibility towards other people, and so he wanted to tell us about one new prisoner on his wing, a frail man in his 70s who's been sent down for 2 years.
Has like long grey hair and a long grey beard. So some of the inmates were kind of like making jokes and saying that Santa came to the wing. And he was walking around in crutches, and he came over to us and he was asking a few questions, because it's his first time in prison. 15 years ago, he filled out a form for his partner, which turned out to be fraud. And then years gone by, and the police had they didn't really want to pursue it, but the CPS kind of persisted and charged him. And then he was on bail for almost 5 years. And then he went to court and he was found guilty. And the judge gave him 2.5 years. And the worst thing about it is he's 76 and he's got dementia. And the crime he committed was 15 years ago. It was a little bit of fraud. There was no victims. He's not harmed to anyone, but the judge deemed it necessary to send him to prison for 2.5 years.
Similarly, George Simonson talks about meeting another prisoner who's on what's called an IPP, a form of indefinite sentence that was technically abolished in 2012, but hundreds of prisoners are still on them.
Rosa also wanted to tell me about how other prisoners are treated. She's spoken to me extensively about the horrible things that other women are going through in Bronzefield, particularly in terms of health issues which aren't getting treatment, as well as what she sees as the unfair reasons why so many people are there.
Yeah, and I think generally this advocacy helps political prisoners feel like they have a purpose for being in prison. Prisons don't rehabilitate people. 46% of prisoners go on to reoffend. The entire point of the prison system is to socially isolate people, to erase them from society. By being so vocal from prison, political prisoners are resisting a system by ensuring that they and other prisoners are not forgotten.
Obviously, as activists, Just Stop Oil prisoners have an inherent sense of purpose around why they're in prison in the first place. And I think I'd assumed that that would help them get through day-to-day life inside.
I asked Luke Elson whether having a why makes his experience of prison any more bearable.
I don't know if it makes prison easier. Like, I've personally struggled for a while and, like, physically and mentally it's told. But it's given me a sense of peace. I'm at peace with the fact that I'm here, and as hard as it is, like, this is the place I need to be right now. And this is the right place to be. Every day I'm in prison is an act of resistance and is a statement and a symbol. And I think the biggest impact I've had when it comes to activism and Just Stop Oil is me being in prison. I think it's a really powerful message to, state to the public. It's like, I sacrificed my liberty, my freedom and my physical and mental health for this cause. This is how important it is to me. Like, I wouldn't make a decision lightly if I didn't think this was the emergency that it is. And, extreme times require extreme response.
Luke finds it a lot easier to talk about why he's in prison than what it's like in prison. Actually, I sometimes got a bit frustrated by this, and I really wanted to ask Luke about his kind of inner world and emotional life. And so often he would kind of bring the conversation back to the climate crisis and why he was there and the necessity of him being in prison. But I do think that is what sustains him, this real sense that he's got a higher purpose being in prison, and that the kind of discomforts and even the suffering that he has to endure for that are a means to an end, really.
And do you think that having a cause would help you in prison personally?
Yeah, definitely. I just can't imagine having the same level of commitment to any cause as they do currently. And for that to be so strong that it actually kind of inoculates you to suffering. Like I think I'm much too focused on my immediate environment and have my political commitments, but they aren't so kind of overriding, I think, in my mind that I would be able to kind of put mind over matter like that, I think. What about you?
So when I spoke to both Anna and Rosa, they told me about just how many letters they get from Just Stop Oil supporters in prison, basically reminding them that what they're doing is really important and reminding them constantly why they're there. And for both of them, I think that was absolutely essential to being able to get through it, basically. I can imagine that if I was in their situation, I would find that incredibly helpful too. It must be so easy to just get, distracted by the difficult things that are going on day to day in prison. But yeah, I think having those reminders that you're doing something for a reason which is much bigger than yourself would be really, really helpful.
And that's, I think, central, that Just Stop Oil activists aren't really alone in prison. In fact, they're very rarely alone. Even at the police station, they have people waiting for you. When you're in prison, they have people sending letters to you. And I think there's this constant reminder that you're part of like a fabric of a political organization, basically. And that is so integral to a sense of mental well-being.
As we talked about in the last episode, Just Stop Oil activists are also sustained by a community. So whether that's rebels in prison organising for them to have prison buddies, or their fellow activists visiting them, calling them, emailing them constantly throughout their time in prison, Just Stop Oil prisoners maintain a very strong feeling of connection to the outside world.
Luke Elson told me that prison is less difficult for him than it is for his loved ones on the outside.
I have to acknowledge, me and Phoebe have acknowledged together that, what we're doing is selfish in a sense that, our actions have consequences for our loved ones. And I've seen my family, worry and, after reassuring them, they feel, confident I'm doing okay in prison, but they miss me. And there's a hole missing because I'm not there. So, I have to weigh that up as well. And, I'm doing this for my loved ones, but, I don't want to get to a point where I'm really hurting them.
The Phoebe that Luke refers to there is his partner Phoebe Plummer, who also happens to be Anna's fellow soup thrower.
They are a kind of case study in what it is like to be both inside and outside. Here's Phoebe talking about what it's like being in prison themselves versus having a partner who's in prison.
In many ways, prison is harder on the people we love who are on the outside than it actually is being inside yourself. I find coping day to day in prison quite easy, and I don't want to make that a broad generalised experience. Some people do struggle, and for good reason, but I find I'm able to get by quite easily day to day in prison. There's actually some bits about it that I quite like. There's lots of things in prison that I'm grateful for that I wouldn't be doing on the outside. But when it's someone you love that you're worrying about, even if you know what prison's like, I feel all of these worries mounting up about how he is and how he's being treated.
Phoebe is worried about how Luke is coping in prison, and that's someone who's also in prison. So just think about all the partners, friends and families of prisoners who aren't even involved in climate activism and feel like they haven't signed up to this. And we are going to think about those people in the next episode.
In episode 3, how prison affects your loved ones. What's it like to see your son sitting in the dock? Can you have a relationship if you and your partner are both in prison? How does it feel when your fiancé chooses a life of resistance over you? That's next time on Committed.
I did say to her at some point while she was being in prison that if she gets out, that she needs to come back straight away or let go of what we have, because I'm not going to sit in the limbo forever.
Committed is a podcast from Novara Media. It was reported and presented by Rivkah Brown and Clare Heimer. The producers were Richard Hames and Chal Ravens. Music and sound editing was by Matt Tuxley. Art direction was by Pietro Garone and Filippo Mara. Thanks to all of the prisoners, their partners, friends and family members who spoke to us for this podcast. Thanks also to their prison buddies, Alex, Jamie, Kate and Pia. And thanks to Bertie Coyle from Just Stop Oil.
Hi, I'm Pietro. I'm head of digital at Novara Media, and my team worked on the art for this show. Novara Media isn't just the people you see in front of the camera or hear behind the microphone. We are a team of over 20 staff, including social media editors, video producers, and the people who hold it all together, all working hard to build a different kind of media. The show you're listening to right now is made possible by all of us, and just as importantly, by thousands of small donations from people like you. If you'd like to support us, go to novara.media/support and give 1 hour's wage per month, or whatever you can afford. Thank you.